Okay, so Tula, hello. Today you are in the historiotherapy chair, and I'm not sure if this is going to be therapeutic or an interrogation session. But I think just over a year ago, when shortly after we became colleagues, you told me that you had been invited to attend a conference in Ukraine. Would you please tell us why, what kind of conference, who was organizing it, and tell us about the invite. Why were you invited?
It is an invite from the Ukrainian History Global Initiative, a remarkable project. Because I don't know about all the projects which are simultaneously on the go as far as historians are concerned, I guess I can't say in that respect that it's unique, but it's certainly unique in my recollection, which is an attempt to engineer an encounter between a very well-developed national historiography that has emerged as far as Ukrainian history is concerned, but bringing it into conversation with global historians, some of them like me, who are not specialists on Ukrainian history, but are fascinated by all of the occasions where Ukraine becomes a center of global geography. I was invited in October 2023 by Professor Timothy Snyder, then of Yale, now of Toronto, to become part of the advisory council for this global history initiative. You were very flat, complimentary to me, saying that a year later I went. There was the first annual conference, which was held last year, which I did not attend, but I attended the one this year. And it was a wonderful, unique, and remarkable experience. And I'm happy to go through the details of what exactly that entailed.
Okay, so we're going to get into the conference in a moment, but first I want to know, you do not have to divulge security secrets, but how did you get to Kiev, or which parts are you allowed to tell? How did you get there?
Turkish Airlines to Istanbul, Turkish Airlines to Warsaw. Flights are not going directly into Kiev, so it was a question of going by road and by train into Ukraine to protect the security of the route. I won't say the exact details, other than we got from Warsaw to Kiev by those means. And it was a remarkable journey because I actually do enjoy the descent in flights where you can see a sort of bird's eye view of a city. But traveling by train, there were some spectacular views in the early morning of the Ukrainian countryside, where the fields are covered by mist. And it was close enough to their summer. I think they may well call it autumn, but the weather was lovely there, to the extent that I came equipped with a winter jacket, and our person accompanying us told us that will not be necessary at all. But it's a magical landscape which they've got there, and a wonderful urban environment in Kiev, which is a gem of a relatively underexplored and underdiscovered at this stage city.
And tell me, one would want to know straight away, could you see signs of the war both in the countryside and in the city?
What is remarkable, and it's remarkable to the extent that it must be conscious, that there is an attempt to wage this war as a free society. The presence of the police is much less ostentatious and intrusive than in many so-called peaceful countries, including many of them which ring our country at the moment. You go there and the police go out of their way to make it know that you're being watched, to get into your business, to interfere, and generally make a nuisance of themselves. Astonished by the lightness of the touch of the government there, and the freedom with which people were transacting. I mean, our city centers have much more tension and much more sense of imminent threat than is what was findable, which is basically in the heart of Kyiv. I must emphasize, though, that I was there for only a couple of days. So in the same way as any negative perceptions would be immediately and wholly justifiably debunkable by saying, you can't just come here not speaking the language and telling us what is going wrong in our country. I can't speak about what is going right in the country either, except to say that I had to remind myself to relax and that perceptions of the danger that you might be going into are not necessarily real. After having dinner at a restaurant, walking home through the city center of Kiev, very, very relaxed, laid-back environment as far as that was concerned. And it must be conscious because governments have used far lesser pretexts to shut down civil liberties and render it a police state. So that was impressive with regards to the culture of the place and the nature of the struggle. And every side goes into war proclaiming justice and freedom on their side, but it's a sort of visceral demonstration of what they mean by it. But as far as Kiev is concerned, if we go away from the here and now, which is obviously the preoccupation which many people will have, and go to it's a city of 1,000 years, and there are layers of that history in terms of their urban landscape. It is a wonderful city in terms of its architecture, in terms of its richness, in terms of its layout, and in terms of we call ourselves Department of Historical and Heritage Studies, but they have a temporal depth which is way beyond anything that we can boast of. Don't want to disparage South Africa. We've got many positives and many things to be glad to be coming back to as far as that is concerned, but it is a wonderful country.
And as you rightly said, the usual academic experience is very much something of a sheltered hit and run experience most of the time. As you said, you come in, you're surrounded by fellow academics, you speak English, you go out to a restaurant, and then you get ferried out again. So interactions are limited, and you try and take in as much as you possibly can. Apart from your impressions of the city, and I think it's a very spot on remark to say that, yes, under lesser pretexts, there are other cities in the world currently occupied by their local police or military forces, and you don't see this in the same way. But interactions with Ukrainians, to what, if at all, any kind of fleeting impressions, and let's call them fleeting impressions because, as you said, it's a very quick visit, but it's something of a lens that we don't get much of otherwise.
Well, besides the conference, which the core of the contributors were Ukrainians, you're basically interacting with the local population. I mean, it starts when you cross the border and there is the check of papers, immigration and customs. They were very, they expedited their work very well. There was a minimum of fuss and a minimum of judicious, over judicious bureaucracy. We arrived at the Kiev railway station, walking around, waiting for the bus to come, just sort of casually passing the local population by, very relaxed interactions as far as that is concerned. Without, I mean, I'm obviously visibly a foreigner who doesn't belong there, but very relaxed interactions as far as that is concerned, and just mingling amongst the population in non-scheduled, non-chaperoned interactions in the center of town. And we were, many people did not want to be constantly on the beaten track, and they wanted to branch off and see various tourist sites. The people who'd attended the conference last year were sort of in the second phase. So we went to, and if you go to Kyiv, you must see St. Sophia Cathedral, which has a lot of their heritage encapsulated in it. But people who'd been there last year decided to do new and different things, like visiting the fortress and the Babi Yar memorial outside town. I didn't get to do that. If I go next year, it'll be my opportunity to graduate beyond that. So there were sort of just those unscripted, informal interactions with the local population, and there were no issues as far as that was concerned. And indeed, those interactions were uniformly pleasant in the brief time that we were there.
So to get to the conference itself, it's almost like an act of defiance to have something of the, one would say, the normality of a conference within a country at war, and at the same time, it's anything but normal. So to reflect on, just the very fact of the conference being organized, and also apart from the locals, I find it interesting that you said there were so many Ukrainian academics. To what extent are they trying to continue, in a sense, normalizing their academic lives in the midst of conflict, or is there no room for normalization?
Well, many of the Ukrainian academics were based in Ukraine, and they are productive. I must let you know, they told me about their system. You don't have tenure, apparently. You have a contract to contract basis, and whereas we're only performance managed when we're going for promotion, it's a constant cycle as far as that is concerned, and they have very high levels of publication or perish. And whilst that sometimes, list of publications on a sheet of paper can sometimes be misleading, I was impressed by the quality of the scholarly standard. To be honest, I think we're a little bit behind as far as that is concerned. What we had was some open sessions. Some of the sessions, people who are writing capsules as part of this publication, which is going to be a huge Oxford University Press supported publication. They presented their capsules and they got feedback. Others, we had sessions where the authors of the capsules, we had open-ended discussions, and I used it as a pretext. And for whatever reason, some of the people who were involved said they found it useful. And I basically used it as an opportunity to interrogate them, everything I wanted to know from a specialist, but never had the opportunity to ask. And they were a captive audience who were there for 90 minutes, and they had to field these questions, and it was a constant stream of them. They had to be mentally agile, and they did it very well. They answered all of the questions, but also maybe I justified my presence in terms of opening up one or two areas where Ukrainian history touches and interfaces with global developments. For example, memory, how we perform historical memory mediated through Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, the differences in the way that it's remembered in Ukraine, what that might tell us about the content of the historiography. For example, many aspects, many historical themes have emerged as a result of the national movement, which has emerged in Ukraine from 2008 onwards. All sorts of these questions about connections, comparisons, contrasts, ways in which we can see each other's history in each other, and also the limits of that, ways in which we're completely different and we're following distinct paths. So those were all features which were there. Incredibly rich conference.
So tell me to drill a bit deeper, what was the specific conference theme?
The conference theme is Ukrainian history viewed broadly, and we went from ancient times, even before the first humans, and we spoke about, well, one of the capsules, for example, was when Ukraine was inhabited by mammoths and reindeers, and the kind of economies that contributed to in terms of the first settlers which were there. Also the signs of early urban settlements in Ukraine as far as 6000 BC. So for example, if we go to 6000 BC, we've got the Tropelian culture, and 3 millennia later, we've got the Una culture, and they're both urban civilizations. And other very rich presentations were about what coins tell us about the integration of Ukraine into the Greek world and the kind of connections that birthed as well. So whilst, of course, the tyranny of the present would inform focusing on privileging the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, all sorts of connections with Indo-Europeans, Ottoman Turks in more contemporary times, but also Ukrainians living under foreign control, not always of the Russians, but sometimes of the Poles or of the Austro-Hungarians. And all of these connections, for example, the connections with the Scandinavian world, with the Vikings, the formation of Kyiv and Rus, and the extent to which that was a foreign implant versus an authentic reflection of indigenous Slavic culture. All of these themes were there, and it was very eye-opening and remarkable encounter of the kind that I came back feeling we need to do something like that in South Africa. I think a test of what you got from a visit is what you would like to import.
So tell me, what did you insert in there? What was your presentation, and what kind of perspectives did you think needed to be put on the table from where you come from?
I was a discussant, and it's anything and everything. I mean, one of them, which I think was important with regards to Holodomor, which has assumed a central role in contemporary Ukrainian historiography, and we had a discussion about when it became rooted in Ukrainian national identity. And one of the obvious questions which I asked is that when people spoke about a rebellion against Soviet rule which outlasted the Second World War, to what extent were these discourses of the very recent famine present amongst those who rebelled? And I had to ask the question twice, because the answer which came first was that it really wasn't there. There was no memory. There was no idea of this being a continuation war. So when exactly did this become a part of national consciousness and identity? And looking at that in historiographical terms, people said it was a consequence of much more recent developments, because when we spoke about the truth and reconciliation and memory, many of the post-91 Ukrainian governments are actually former communists. It's an argument which Tony Jupp made in his post-war history of Europe, which is that many of the people who overthrew the communist order in Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet bloc were former communist apparatchiks, so they didn't want to have a deep-going perpetrators and victims narrative. It's only recently where the Holodomor has become a much more central theme. And we had many back and forth questions as far as this was concerned, but then a question came to me quite late, and it was actually in the last panel which I was the discussant on, which is that we've been thinking about this as being collectivization, about being rural. And if somebody speaks about it being affecting the peasantry, the response would be, how do you characterize the peasantry? In other words, a very clear geographical location, but this is something which is happening in rural Ukraine. And then we tried to come up with questions about how did it impinge on the cities? Did it affect urban intellectuals? Of which point the sort of question came to me, which is that world history, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin 101, is that collectivization is part of a process of industrialization. It's a means of, in a sense, exploiting the countryside in order to support the cities. And so surely one of the things that we know about Ukraine is that it's got a very powerful industrial belt in the east. And wasn't that part of the story? Can we write a fuller history of the 5-year plan? Because collectivization is surely a part of that. And it's not, and it is a contribution which is not without merit. And flying back, I realized that it certainly does, because one of the things which people who are following the present war, for example, the siege of Mariupol, they would have followed the operations in the Azovstal complex, which is one of the largest of its kind. When was Azovstal constructed? It was constructed in 1930, and that would have been, looking at the chronology, it would have been a 5-year plan project. So Ukraine's experience in that time, arguably, I'm not here to force anything on anybody because there is that tension and I can't impose my version on somebody else's history, although as a cosmopolitan looking at it globally, the attempt to construct the world's first socialist society is by any standard a major departure point in world history. And it looks like Ukraine is central to that, both in terms of its agricultural resources, with its capacity to serve as a breadbasket, but also in terms of its industrial resources. And it's that kind of riffing with each other, back and forth interaction, that conversational historiography, which we were in a sense practicing, which I think was one of the great virtues of that event. Sometimes it takes an outsider to come in with some abstract perspective, which people who are drilling down on the empirical detail and at a great depth sometimes might miss. Those who were there thought that some of these reflections were useful with regards to providing some sort of bird's eye perspective. I was very gratified as far as that was concerned. It meant that the pleasure was mutual, but it was a very exciting historical encounter, and certainly elements of it that I think that we would be well versed to embrace.
What I find interesting, actually, Thula, that is a very nice question, because you got my mind running straight away, the extent to which, in a sense, yes, collectivization then, the socialist project, is actually ahead of the movement in which capitalist agriculture has gone in the 20th century and even more recently, because now it's more and more the case of commercial farming on scale, pushing out, essentially consolidating farms into massive enterprises. And very often these enterprises take up parts of the production process on site. So that absolutely makes sense, bringing the agricultural into the industrial. And then again, it's, these are very important comparisons to be made, that, the capitalist versus socialist industrialization very much following a similar logic, the logic of scale. But also what I would be interested in, being, just sitting here and watching from afar, straight away, just the invention of nations. So, because that would have been my question, especially at a time when this country is at war. These are the times when people assert or reassert a national identity. But as you pointed out earlier on, now this is a place of movement and migration and shifting borders. Very much in the same way, if you look at Southern Africa as we know it, because our borders are very artificial constructs. To what extent do they also regard borders, national borders, as constructs or not? Or is there this, you know, this movement to create a history of a nation, but then not just any history of a nation? You always need a glorified past, which all nationalisms have, including all the nationalisms that have been in power in our own country.
Yeah, I think that's another important test of maturity of we obviously need some sort of global positioning for readers in the 21st century about where the events we're speaking about are happening. And in that context, the use of Ukraine as a term to discuss where events were happening 6,000 years ago is important. But then you can't speak of Ukraine as being a nation state at that time. You can't speak about it as being we ancient Ukrainians. And I mentioned to you before going there, the perspective from which I was speaking about it, sort of giving myself a bit of skin in the game, having been born in Swaziland or Eswatini. We can say that, the first mathematical object, the Lubombo bone, was found in the Lubombo Mountains. That's where it gets its name from. The birth of mining. One of the earliest mines was in the Ingwenya Mountains, where there was mining for specularite. So those are not small inventions as far as the history of humankind is concerned. But to speak about these as being ancient Swazis is historically illiterate. You can speak about Swaziland or Eswatini as being the geographical location where inhabitants invented it. As a historian and having the integrity of a historian, you've got to sort of insert those sort of reflections into the discussion. And they were absorbed without a trace, which is a sign of strength rather than weakness as far as the community of historians is concerned. And there were a lot of papers which, looking into literature, looking into linguistics, and trying to identify the exact moment at which Ukraine as a nation, rather than Ruthenians or Little Russians or all of these other identities, the moment at which Ukrainian nationalism emerged as a thing in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that was it's important that whatever the correct or the true answer to that would be, that the project involved historians opening a telescope and trying to find that precise moment of rupture. That was important too.
Because there's a very important distinction to be made between studying the origins of Ukraine as a nation versus studying the origins of Ukrainian nationalism. The one, I won't say implies more reflection than the other.
And that's what they were doing, and they were trying to be very precise and accurate and rigorous as far as that was concerned, which was very good.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And I'm also interested to know if, were there other historians from Africa at this conference?
I was the only one from Africa. Just to close the following, the previous section, this was not an exercise in patriotic history. It was an exercise in global history and finding Ukraine's place in that, and it was all the more valuable for that. There were others who, like myself, did not have a Ukrainian history specialization, but they were people with a specialization in other regions of the world, which the organizers felt perhaps would offer useful and interesting contrasts and comparisons. I was the only one from Africa.
Okay, so I want to get back to the regions, but that is actually, the way in which you articulate it. There's a massive difference between, being critical of patriotism, and this is not an exercise in patriotism, as you say. That actually alludes to a lot of scholarly maturity. Did you come across, though, any tension between public history and this kind of academic history? Because we all know what goes on within university departments versus how a state positions itself with regards to its history. Could you pick up on differences there?
That touches on an important theme, which is that once this project is complete, the 3 million words are complete, they will be open to the world forever. And that's the ideal of the project. It is an exercise in public history, and in his introduction to the proceedings, Timothy Snyder spoke about this. The title, I'm paraphrasing, I can't get the exact words, but it was Writing for a Public, not writing for fellow academics, not getting bogged down in the controversy of the day, trying to speak about who will be reading this in 10 or 15 years. And it was a remarkable presentation. I wish it was recorded. Unfortunately, it wasn't. But one of the observations he made is you need to think as a writer writing for the public of the various ways where people will be reading it. For example, on a train carriage or in a military camp before waging an argument with fellow conscripts about this aspect of the history. All of these dynamics, which, I sometimes think of myself as being a writer who's tried to write public-facing history, but I never thought about it in those depths with regards to audiences and locations and narratives. We were given an example of the kind of model that they're looking for the Ukrainian Global History initiative, which is an edited book, and I've got to paraphrase it again. France in the World. It's a work which was published sometime in the 2010s. It became a bestseller there with hundreds of thousands, sorry, 100,000 sales of the work. So it managed to cross that boundary, but it's written in a very popular and accessible style. There were copies of the book which were made available for us to consult as contributors there of the style that is being looked for. And that just highlighted the ways in which writing for a public is different from writing from fellow academics and scholars. It's a central tension that they're trying to navigate.
This is wonderful. It's as I say, it's making art in the middle of a war zone, in a sense, because this is what history is about. This is what we do. The fact that they continue to do it in that way. Any insights that you found from other regions pertaining to Ukraine that you found interesting?
They were ubiquitous. I mean, there was a great deal of parallels being drawn with the history of the Baltics, also history of Germany as well. They were all just useful points of comparison, of discussion and interrogation. Putting me on the spot, I can't remember the specific individual ones now, but there was a great deal of comparative uh, insight about, other aspects of the Greek world or other areas of the Indo-European invasion. One of the most interesting ones was one of the important things you need to know about is that Ukraine is the area where the forest ends and the steppe begins, and it's another way of thinking of the contrast between Europe and Asia, the contrast between settled populations and nomadic ones, and the ways in which that geographical, ecological boundary, when it is overlapped, it leads to the connection of these cultural and historic worlds. That was another interesting as well.
And any parallels that you could see from, let's say, Southern Africa and Ukraine that you thought were useful?
Well, if one of them, I mean, from the different ways in which we remember history, but also shared discourses of colonialism. One of the, besides the Ukraine Global History Initiative, there was another parallel event, which is the Yalta Europe Summit, which was held, and I was able to participate in the discussion on the opening days of the panel. It's striking the extent to which the present struggle, the Ukrainian diplomacy is trying to harness discourses of anti-colonialism and resistance to foreign powers as a means of bridging the divide between themselves and many in the global south who are perceived to be viewing this as a conflict of the West opposing Russia's legitimate demands, or at least that's how it's framed, and how those discourses are introduced and developed there. I think that our historiotherapy podcast, once we actually get it up, will actually be able to add something in many ways about the connections, direct connections between Ukraine and South Africa when we manage to get that podcast going, the ways in which we are actively and not just abstractly connected as far as historical processes are concerned. One of the interesting things that certainly would be interesting to me would be comparing 1930s industrialization, because we have a massive industrial growth spurt, and it seems as though under Soviet rule, the Soviets are really pushing that very hard as far as that is concerned, and comparing the historical transformations. Lindy, there's so much. Let me just give you one more. The attempt to carve out a space for Ukrainian as a language, as a distinct language, so many parallels with the journey of Afrikaans, the ways in which some members of the cultural elite look down upon it as being a peasant language or a kitchen language, whereas others appropriate it as a means of nationalist assertion. The linguistic politics were there in a major way. If you were to give me space to ramble on, I would be able to come up with all of these other additional parallels, but there was a lot there. There was a lot.
Well, I can spend all day talking about how language nationalism is a precursor for political nationalism, and I think Benedict Anderson has just changed my worldview forever, which is why I was asking about these inventions of a nation, because I can't help but think of Anderson. But you're right. Let's say that this has got to be the start of even more conversations. And I assume that we're having this conversation in a year from now, because you just mentioned off the cuff that, yes, next year you'll be visiting other tourist sites. So obviously you want to go back.
Oh, I'd love to go back. It's a wonderful and rich country, which, having only been there for a couple of days, barely explored, and looking forward to finding out more about it and engaging again with the scholars who are involved in the project.
Well, waiting with bated breath, and can't wait to read the result.